Hello, welcome to the second video in our trip through Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. Should have read pages 101 to 200 if you're following along. And as I was sort of reviewing sort of what happens in here just to try and get like the plot out, quickly realized that this novel is actually really hard to kind of summarize or pinpoint as far as plot goes because of how it's structured, because of how Billy sort of jumps back and forth between times. But if you had to sort of say what the kind of main plot was, it would be, Billy, again, his recounting of the Dresden bombing. If you remember that very first prologue or that first chapter, the author is basically saying that Dresden and the firebombing is what he wants to write about. And he's doing it in this sort of very kind of disorienting way with all of this temporal displacement and these science fiction elements thrown in there. And if you notice, there's actually two parts in what we read where the author is actually there. He interjects himself. One of them's on page 160. Again, if you're using this edition, on page 160, he's having like aggressive diarrhea, basically. So that's the author. So anyway, in what we've read, Billy has been captured, right? He's a prisoner of war. We get a lot of talk about the Englishmen who the Germans have sort of put kind of in charge of the prisoners of war because of some like logistical mishap. They're receiving way more supplies from the Red Cross than is necessary, so they have this huge stockpile. So they welcome the American prisoners, and we learn about that. We're introduced to some characters. We have Edgar Derby, who right off the start, when he's introduced, Billy already tells us that he's going to get shot by a firing squad. So there's that. There's an element of fatalism that this novel has, and in what we read today, the concepts of like free will and fate are introduced, and the aliens that capture Billy tell him that on all the planets they visited, Earth is the only one where people talk about free will. And again, for them, they see time as like happening all at once. So the concept of free will, which is like the idea, right, that you have choice and your actions are not determined, all that stuff. That concept doesn't make sense to them because of how they perceive time and space. So anyway, I say that because again, when Derby's introduced, we're immediately told that he's going to die. And there's that refrain that Vonnegut keeps repeating over and over, so it goes, so it goes, so it goes. And it becomes sort of, at first, it's a kind of element of black humor almost. But the more and more that it's happening, sort of again, the more that sort of fatalism theme comes in. Like, it's a shrug of the shoulders, like, what are we going to do? When Billy's in the zoo and he has that big speech about, you guys live in peace, tell me how to live in peace. And they tell him that's a stupid question. Because again, for them, it's like, you can't change anything. They even tell him that we know how the universe is going to end. And we also get in this section that we read, Billy basically tells you how he dies. He's assassinated by this Lazaro feller. Pretty sure anyway. I think that's his name, Lazaro. He's the guy that kills the dog, like the worst guy ever. He's all about revenge. Okay. So the English prisoners were told, quote, the Germans thought that they made war look stylish and reasonable and fun. So there's that. we're introduced to a character. So when Billy's in prison, or not in prison, but he's in a hospital, it's one of the things he keeps flashing back and forth to. He's next to a guy who has all these science fiction novels, and they're all by this guy named Kilgore Trout, which is a character that sort of comes in and out of a lot of Vonnegut's novels, and he's kind of a stand-in in some ways for Vonnegut himself, but also just this sort of made-up pulp sci-fi writer that Vonnegut, again, sort of puts in a lot of his books. There are actually books published under that name, Kilgore Trout, that other people wrote. Just it was kind of an in joke, basically. Anyway, neither here nor there. There are some important sort of thematic things to point out. One of them is this idea of the new gospel this is on page 138. Speaking of Kilgore Trout, Rosewater, who's the one who's got all those books in bed next to him, has a book called The Gospel from Outer Space about an outer space visitor who made a serious study of Christianity to learn, if he could, why Christians found it so easy to be cruel. He concluded that at least part of the trouble was slipshod storytelling in the New Testament. He supposed that the intent of the Gospels was to teach people, among other things, to be merciful even to the lowest of the low. But the Gospels actually taught this: before you kill somebody, make absolutely sure he isn't well connected. So this new gospel that is introduced, right? Because the idea is that, Christ was not actually the lowest of the low. He was, the son of the most powerful being in the universe, and readers understood that. So that's the lesson they take away. So the new gospel is basically kind of the opposite, or not the opposite, but just Jesus would have been just a man, and then right at his moment of death, God would have intervened. So that idea that again, there's sort of like some religious undertones throughout the whole thing, but this is definitely sort of a kind of poking or a critique of the Christ story, and maybe not even the story itself, but the way that people have interpreted that, and that despite sort of the mercy message behind it, that, because again, there's that Crusades theme that's also running through, which was wars waged in the name of God. How can people that profess to be Christians basically advocate any type of war or any type of violence when it is seemingly antithetical to, what Christ's message. So anyway, there's that in there. There's also this character is introduced, Howard W. Campbell Jr., who is another character that Vonnegut has in sort of standing in here for kind of ideas. But he used to be an American, and then he became the German minister. He rose high in the German Ministry of Propaganda. Basically, he was a Nazi. He would later hang as a war criminal. So, we have that background. And he writes this book about how Germans are kind of to treat American prisoners. And basically, he's trying to psychoanalyze them. And Vonnegut does this thing where this American, who is now a Nazi, delivers this really astute observation about the American public. And again, he's talking about soldiers. And again, this is in Vietnam. He's writing in '69 when Vietnam was happening. And historically, the people that are both drafted and the people that actually voluntarily enlist come from the lower classes. So it's poor people generally that are fighting in the wars. And this is on page 164. This is a passage from the book that Campbell. America is the wealthiest nation on earth, but its people are mainly poor, and poor Americans are urged to hate themselves. It is in fact a crime for an American to be poor, even though America is a nation of poor. Every other nation has folk traditions of men who were poor but extremely wise and virtuous, and therefore more estimable than anyone with power and gold. No such tales are told by the American poor. They mock themselves and glorify their betters. The meanest eating or drinking establishment, owned by a man who is himself poor, is very likely to have a sign on its wall asking this cruel question: if you're so smart, why ain't you rich? There will also be an American flag no larger than a child's hand, glued to a lollipop stick and flying from the cash register. And this is on page 165. They do not love one another because they do not love themselves. Once this is understood, the disagreeable behavior of American enlisted men in German prisons ceases to be a mystery. So I think this is really interesting because, again, this is written in 1969, but this is definitely something that still happens today, and the kind of criminalization of people that are poor and how being poor becomes attached to some kind of morality or virtue. And it goes, if you're poor, obviously that means that you have either done something bad or you are just a bad person, because if you would just get your stuff together and go work like the rest of us, you would not be poor. And being poor is stigmatized and it's demonized even. And this is what this American turned Nazi is pointing out. This is why Americans behave the way they do when they're in prison. The line, they do not love one another because they do not love themselves, I think is so sort of chilling and profound. And again, it's something we still live with today, lower classes, and that, the wealth inequality is becoming more and more of an issue. And it's something that we're becoming more and more aware of. It's always been there. And if you looked, you could see it. Again, Vonnegut is not the first person to notice this. But especially now, it feels like we're constantly sort of inundated with all this news and media, and more people have voices than have ever had them before. And so because of that, at least one of the things that happens is that you become more aware of all of these disparities. So anyway, those are some interesting things. So as far as plot, again, they arrive at Dresden. It's this beautiful city. There's these descriptive passages of it. This is on page 189. The skyline was intricate and voluptuous and enchanted and absurd. It looked like a Sunday school picture of heaven to Billy Pilgrim. Somebody behind him in the boxcar said, Oz. That was I. That was me. The author. The only other city I'd ever seen was Indianapolis, Indiana. So they arrive in Dresden. It's beautiful. They're told, don't worry, it won't be bombed. This is not a military target. It's an open city. You're good. But again, Vonnegut, we've already been told that it does get bombed, even if you didn't know historically. The narrator tells you explicitly that that's what happens. So those are basically some of the things I wanted to say. Not rambling too much. If I could point out one more passage, this is on page 112. The aliens are describing their type of fiction. And I only think this is important because they're basically describing what this novel is. And so I think it's important. The Tralfamadorians read, there isn't any particular relationship between all the messages, except that the author has chosen them carefully, so that when seen all at once, they produce an image of life that is beautiful and surprising and deep. There is no beginning, no middle, no end, no suspense, no moral, no causes, no effects. What we love in our books are the depths of many marvelous moments seen all at one time. And so again, the aliens, they perceive time sort of simultaneously. And you can see that this novel is laid out sort of, it's trying to do that, but obviously it can't because we don't perceive time, all at once. It's still linear. But one of the things that Vonnegut is trying to do is fracture the narrative into all these little pieces and so that it all sort of comes together at the end, like a mosaic, and it does sort of create depth of feeling for Billy and people like Derby. You feel for them. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. My recommendation for this week, if you are liking this book because of its science fiction elements, its alienness, its kind of throwback 60s aliens. One of my favorite science fiction novels of all time is The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. You may have read this or at least heard of it before, but this book actually came out in the 50s, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, 1950. So it's older than Slaughterhouse-Five. But Bradbury and Vonnegut were contemporaries of each other. They were writing at the same time. They were both writing science fiction. They were both Bradbury specifically is a giant in the science fiction field and just literature in general. He is sort of a writer's writer. He is, when you read him, you can tell that he is carefully crafting each word in the same way that when we read Blood Meridian and Beloved, you can tell that those writers, Toni Morrison and Cormac McCarthy, are deeply engaged with the craft itself. Bradbury is another one of those. This is a book that's basically just about Earth colonizing Mars, and it's a Mars that, it's the 50s. They would have known that sort of Mars, there are people that live on Mars, and, they're walking around with, and Earthlings go there. And anyway, my point is, it's not like scientifically accurate. It's more of like a fantasy, and it's told like Slaughterhouse-Five in all these different stories. So each chapter is like its own story. It used to be a bunch of short stories, and then it was sort of cobbled together into this book. It was called a fix-up novel. It happened a lot more often back in the 50s and 60s. Anyway, neither here nor there. But if you're looking for something to read because you're really digging on Vonnegut science fiction, his aliens, definitely check out The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. I do not think you will be disappointed. In the meantime, continue on through Slaughterhouse-Five. We're reading till the end of the book. We'll have one more of these. We'll figure out what happens to Billy, even though we already know what happens to Billy. But we will figure out how Vonnegut tells that story, which is kind of the point. So I will see you then. You guys have a great week.